Welcome to Out of the Blank.
Welcome to another episode of Out of the Blank podcast. I'm here with Dr. Kisi Bohn. It's a pleasure to have you on the show. Is there a little bit you want to tell the audience about yourself?
Wow. Well, I'm a biologist at Johns Hopkins. I'm an assistant professor there. I'm also the Director of Undergraduate Studies for Behavioral Biology and the chair for Behavioral Biology there. I've got a PhD from University of Maryland, a master's from Idaho State, and a bachelor's from UC San Diego. My research is focused on bats, of all things, and I don't know what else to add.
Well, behavioral biology. So if your particular focus is with bats, for instance, what exactly are you examining in bats?
Well, I say that my focus is on bats, but really I'm interested in how communication, including, say, human speech, evolves and how speech is produced. So both mechanistically and evolutionarily. The other thing that I've been interested in is social behavior and cooperation. Both social complexity and vocal complexity are two things that humans have that many animals, many would say all animals, don't have to the same extent that we do. And that makes it difficult to try to study it, right? We don't have another model for looking at, some of the most extreme characteristics of humans. And it ends up that bats kind of fall into this category where they both cooperate and have complex social interactions, and they also produce complex sounds.
So when it comes to like the evolution of speech, for instance, when we talk about I don't know if this would be the same category, but how when someone's thinking about somebody, then randomly you get a text in that sense, people call that a coincidence. But I mean, is that just like an evolutionary pattern that you could see, like people maybe a sense of empathy, for instance? Some people can sense like empathetic, like for instance, if you were to get sad, I could tell by your face that you are sad, or maybe you're heading in that direction, or maybe a topic that might be a little bit something you don't really want to talk about. For instance, I would be able to sense that through a facial recognition. Now with speech, for instance, do you see like I would say a pattern of like speech evolving in a sense to a point where we get something like a communication like how bats do, maybe not with echolocation or some aspect of that sort, but maybe an evolved form where we'll be able to, like, I'm not saying superpowers like telepathy, but in a sense, I mean, being able to understand more from speech than what we do now?
I don't know if I would say it in that sense. I mean, we are already pretty good communicators. And when it comes to things like empathy, these are, if you think about it, how do we, study what an animal is thinking and whether or not they're emotionally empathizing with others? That is very, extremely difficult. We're able to do this because we can communicate it. But another animal isn't going to be, there is some research in that side of it, potentially the emotionality side of it. But I look more at the basics. So what facilitates, what makes us able to produce speech, right? So we use audio vocal feedback. That is, we constantly are, if someone is deafened, over time, their speech will degrade. We're constantly using our own hearing to produce speech, okay? That is not true for the majority of animals and most of their vocalizations, right? They're more on the level of, you might think of as baby crying, right? Even a baby that is deaf is going to cry, right? So that's one thing that makes speech stand out compared to other animals. Another thing that makes speech stand out is that we learn, and that, of course, requires this audio vocal feedback, right? So for most animals, and again, not all, Vocalizations are innate. That is, they're just they're not learned um, from others. Okay, so that's number two. Um, Number three is our ability to produce or have highly syntactical organization, meaning we have complex ways in which we combine elements, say words, and actually we have phonemes within words. And from those, we can produce sentences. Now, the extreme of that in humans is that we can create almost an infinite number of quote combinations or information from that. Most of the animal vocalizations do not have this kind of syntactical organization where they have specific notes or elements that are combined in specific ways. So that is as far as we're getting for the most part, on the animal side of things.
So like for humans, for instance, a lot of that is like learn, you kind of hear it and then you learn, you kind of adjust to, but with animals, it's more instinctual. For instance, like, so okay, how I understand, like, how do you measure something like that though? Is that just from hearing animals and being able to detect the patterns that where it's just consistent the whole time, and then humans are kind of sporadic? Because I look at like the English language, for instance. Now with some accents, it kind of probably throws a monkey wrench into a lot of the processing of information. There are some accents I just can't understand, but it's the words that we use as well too. For instance, some words that we used to use 10, 15 years ago, they're not being used today. So kids that are being born today don't know what those words are and wouldn't know them. Like they wouldn't know the word boondoggle, which just means you're fiddling around at work. Now that's just the language update, I would say, and like kind of cutting down sentences. It seems like words are now kind of cut into like GTG means gotta go before you would just say it. So
right, but that's an example that happens in humans because we're vocal learners. So you're going to have cultural evolution or cultural modification of vocalizations over time, right? I mean, I would say texting is an extreme example, right? So we now have, we've all learned, LOL and all of these other things, right? So we humans have this open-ended learning, and in animals, those that do learn, there aren't that many that, and I'm trying to think of examples where we have evidence of this kind of open-ended learning. Now, there are some cases. So for example, I don't know if you know mockingbirds, right? They're kind of everywhere, but those guys, males, learn songs and learn sounds from around them all the time. And so they're constantly, you never know what they're going to produce. It depends on what they hear. But the majority of animals don't have this kind of open-ended learning. Now, the other thing that we're finding, or what is generally seen, and again, this isn't all animals, there are definite exceptions. For example, some of our cetaceans and dolphins use a lot of social communication sounds. And it's not that birds don't, but birds, for example, have been one of our main models for examining vocal learning, because our birds, the birds you sing, most of the birds you hear singing with these elaborate, beautiful songs, those are learned, but they're not as open-ended, and they're really just communicating that they are sexy dudes. So it's not this necessarily this interaction going on where you would see this evolution over time of the elements, that are used.
So is it because of our kind of like hearing and then learning, or that process feedback that humans have, that makes our evolution of communication change so rapidly? Because it seems like it could just be a small adjustment could affect the whole discourse of how we communicate. But if we look at like animals, for instance, they're kind of using the same methods. Now that might have to do with like intelligence, for instance, like they can't really recognize the different speech patterns and they're not able to like analyze their own speech patterns. But in a sense, the way that they communicate is different. Their mating calls are different than their normal calls, for instance. There's a recognition in that. But for us, it's just we have more of a drastic change. I mean, eventually to think that all of our communication wouldn't be through a device rather than through actual words, for instance. I mean, how many people, text to go to dinner with their family rather than actually say, hey, do you want to go to dinner? Like that's a different
So
method.
that is the faculty of language, not which it goes above and beyond the production of speech, right? And that is something so far we have only found in humans.
So, okay, so what would so for another animal, for instance, if we talk about, let's say, bats, the way that they communicate, for instance, now that's a what correlations do you have between bats and then humans on that aspect?
So we have some of the early aspects that I've talked as far as we know. The other thing we can go into is there's a lot we don't know. So a side note, I mean, there's 1,400 species of bats. They're a quarter of all mammals are bats. We think that they're really rare and obscure, but they're actually everywhere. They're on every continent except for Antarctica. No, either the Arctic or Antarctica. They are, and from every type of environment you can imagine, they're flying over your head every night in the city you live in. You're just not aware of them because you don't see them and you don't hear them. So what we know about bats is like this compared to, how much potential is out there. So that's caveat number one. And that is also part of the reason why I study bats, because we didn't really have the tech to be able to record them easily in the field, because they use ultrasound, that is ultrasound being above our human hearing, which means very high frequency sounds. And to record those sounds, if you can imagine, if you visualize like a sound wave, right? And you're trying to figure out the frequency of that wave, you've got to sample it at least twice during one cycle. So that means your sample rate has to be at least twice the frequency. Now, what does that mean? Well, if we're talking about a bat sound that's 100 kilohertz, that means we need to sample it 200,000 samples per second. Today, that's doable, but imagine 20 years ago, I used to actually in the 80s, they were using reel to reels, or we would use, because you have to speed everything up, you have to sample at such a high rate and then slow it back down, right? So this was that's why we don't really know much about bats in comparison to, say, birds and some of our other animals, right? So and that's part of why I got into bats, because I was working on them when we were getting more and more tech, so that we could actually record these. And you never know what you'll find. For instance, back in 2005, I was working in Trinidad, and I would be out there with a high-speed NIDAC card that I was soldering to a laptop computer, which I would fill the entire hard drive within like 3 minutes of recordings, and then save all those. I had like hundreds of zip disks, right? So that gives you an idea. How, and that was 15 years ago. So that's my caveat number one, which got me sidetracked. What we are finding, right, is that, and what are easier, let me go another thing about what we don't know. You go into a bat cave or where bats are, and you don't really hear much, maybe some squeaking. But once you're recording in the ultrasonic range, it is chaos in there. They are, and we're not quite sure what all they're doing. And I'm not saying that I think that they're like, are little humans or anything. But we really don't know what all they're doing, because it's also hard. Imagine trying to figure out which bat is saying what in pitch black when they can be really small and crammed in together, right? And they're all, so there's all these vocalizations we don't know. Now, the ones that we can work with are really ones that are in specific contexts, and ones that we record and pick up repeatedly. And that has tended to be courtship songs. And what we're finding is that bats sing, not all, and again, there's 1,400 species of bats, which I will repeat over and over. A bat is not a bat, is not a bat, right? You've got bats that are like this big, and you have bats with the wingspan of a small car, right? So they're very, very diverse. But that said, some species of bats produce complex songs that sound like are similar to bird songs. Now, we've been finding this independently, that is, in different kind of families of bats. So it is not ubiquitous. So it appears to have evolved multiple times. So we can answer, we're working towards answering this question: why do some animals develop vocal learning and some don't? Okay. And now let me go back again. Why bats? Well, bats use sonar, they use echolocation. And so what that means is that they're producing ultrasonic vocalizations, right? And then perceiving the echoes and using those echoes to orient, navigate, catch tiny insects. They can do all sorts, basically see. To do that, they are not only having to rapidly modify and produce vocalizations, but they have audio vocal feedback because they're constantly listening to their own echo and then modifying their outgoing vocalization depending on what echo they receive. So some of those early phases of vocal learning and speech are present in all echolocating bats in the form of already having this highly specialized vocal system that is coupled with audio vocal feedback. So, yeah.
Well, so is that something that they learned to adapt because of the fact that they weren't so successful in their survival rate of catching insects and being able to communicate, or being able to like we know that their vision isn't exactly the best, if I'm not mistaken. That's what I've heard. So they use echo communication as well too.
No, the main reason they use, so it's a little bit of a wives' tale, but their vision is probably not as good as a daytime. So that the whole reason for echolocation is so that they can fly at night. It's to avoid, so it evolved over about, we think 60 to 80 million years ago, right? Once echolocation evolved, they then had an environment where they had few predators and very few competitors, because they're flying in, they fly in pitch black, flying and catching insects in flight. Where most animals cannot do this. Even with the best vision possible, you're not going to be able to see a mosquito flying in the middle of the night and chase it and catch it.
So it wasn't an evolution out of necessity. It was an evolution out of just because they kind of could. I mean, it's the way.
Well, that, we'd have to get in our time machine. I mean, there's some good, we don't know 100% which came first, flight or echolocation, right? That's still kind of debated. And it's hard to determine, they're determining some of it by fossils and looking at, but, which we'll learn more. The exact story isn't completely known. But once it did evolve, right? Just like, for example, we have, I think 6,000 species of birds. It could be more. So don't quote me on that. We have a lot of bird species. Why do we have a lot of bird species? Because they have a novel adaptation. They can fly. So the same thing happened with bats. Once you had bats that were capable of using echolocation, you had this huge diversification in radiation. And so that's why a quarter of all mammal species are bats, right? They have a niche that they are able to take advantage of.
So what are the, I guess, future capabilities, I would say, of learning about stuff like this?
Well, you know what? I don't know, which is why it's so exciting. Who knows what we're going to find next? That's the thing. So let me start with this. Let me play some sounds, right? So let's start with what happens with sonar.
You mentioned something important, which is the amount that we don't know. And in a sense, it's good that we don't know. I think for the longest time, we thought that animals just made different noises, and we kind of left it there. But with the technology, we're realizing that bats have a very expansive, I guess, language or communication system that we're.
So I wouldn't say language, right? We're going to stay away from language, because that's a pretty human trait and takes a lot of different evidence. But we don't know, compared to, say, what we know about birds and animal, and I'm not trying to pick on birds, but bird song has been studied since the 50s, longer than that, but extensively for 60, 70 years, because it's brought about all sorts of amazing advances in our understanding of animal communication. But that's because biologists could literally go out in their backyard and, oh my God, I have this bird singing, let me record it, right? And then, etc. And so bats are a good 50 years behind, right? What we know about birds. So, and it could be it ends up that bats are really, that the limit of their communication is similar to birds, which is still pretty outstanding. I mean, we're talking, I mentioned courtship songs, or, songs of males, but there are also species like parrots, where you have long-term pair bonding and they're constantly calling back and forth to each other. Dr. Tim Wright has been working on those guys, if you want to look him up. So, we are still learning things. I'm not saying we know everything there is to know about birds. But going back to bats, we don't know. And it could end up that, there is this kind of limit to what that, humans really are especially spectacular, unique in this capacity for language. Right now, that appears to be the case. And it takes a lot of neural specializations for language. And so it's a costly thing to evolve. The organisms had to reap a lot of benefits because brain tissue is expensive.
Yeah.
So whether or not bats would actually do this, because they also fly, so their size is limited, we don't know, is basically the long story short. But it is an exciting field. You ask, why do I do what I do? Why do I stick with bats? It's not just that I'm a crazy bat lady. It's because to me, it's this, like, I never know, I go out with and now I have a small little device. I can plug it into my iPad and I can record at 200,000 samples per second. And who knows what bat I'm going to record flying around, or what, call I'm going to get, because the odds are high that no one has done it wherever I am.
Yeah.
So I like to be that adventurer, I guess.
Well, it's pretty cool that you can be able to tell like distinctive communication aspects from, I guess, different bats. I mean, with humans, it's different. You could tell like if you know that person, but if you're able to just pull out a specific category or specific type of bat based on their communication aspects, I just look at it. If we're now getting better technology to be able to analyze, like you were saying before about like the bits of sound, for instance, you have to take like this. And
well, and it used to be, what do you think Siri is? That's all speech. So it used to be, and this is really advanced, so basically take the type of analyses required to do speech processing and recognize words by Siri. I do the same thing, but with bat sound. I take the sound waves, excuse me, and then it's a bit more simple in my level, because our sounds are more what you would call tonal, whereas we produce, speech has formats. It's kind of a noisy, we call it noisy broadband kind of signal. But we basically are doing those same types of analyses, but on bat vocalizations instead of human speech.
Yeah, but wouldn't bats be more complicated because of the sound frequency that they're on?
No, the sound. Once we get the sample rate down, actually, it depends on the vocalization, but not really. Let me play some sound. They'll sound relatively simple. So these are all slowed down. Okay. And let me share my screen. So, all right. So I'll start with, this is slowed down echolocation. Okay. So it's a little quiet, right? But you hear beep, beep, beep. So that was a bat that was catching an insect, right? So they produce these pulses, they get an echo back, they produce a pulse, they get an echo back. Oh, they see an insect, and when they hone in on that insect, they rapidly, they produce what we call a buzz, because it sounds almost like a buzz to our ears, because we can sometimes hear it. All right, here's another echolocation from another species. Right, so relatively simple, because but each species they have evolved echolocation that is adapted specifically to what their environment is and what they forage on, right? So now let me go to there. So those are sonar signals. Those really have evolved for sensing the environment.
Wait, so they're sending out a call, and those little beeps, the little chirps, I would say, those are little pulses that are going out, and then when it detects something, it basically directs them to something that's in front of them.
Exactly.
That's awesome. That's so
Yeah.
sophisticated.
That might way more. Heck, I don't even think our sonar can do what bats can do, right? So now let's play. I'm going to play one of a species of bat that I studied, Tidera brasiliensis, and you'll notice that this is going to sound different. This is a courtship song. All right, so I'll play it one more time. Okay, so very different than, I mean, it's still, because of the frequency, the tone is going to sound similar. It's going to sound like chirps because our ears are not very good at picking up these little kind of short signals. Let me play another bat from the same species singing a song and see if you can tell that it's a different bat.
It's a different pattern.
Different pattern, right? So you can see, you know, where it's both simple but also complex. You've got this dun 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 dun. So these are different elements that they combine in a specific way, right? And then those are combined into phrases. Like you also heard the da, that's a different phrase. They can swap around those phrases, right? Much like we can swap around words. So there's this syntactical organization, right? Which was one of our early checklists, right? So whether or not, we're still working on whether or not, or to what degree these vocalizations are learned. But given that bats already have audio vocal feedback, it is not, and we've already found vocal learning in multiple species, not all by any means, right? It wouldn't be surprising though if we find vocal learning in other species as well. So then we can study when and why and how does vocal learning evolve, and when, why, and how do you, because I have other bats from the same family and their songs are different. Some are simple, some are complex. So why and how does this evolve?
Don't some humans, like musicians, for instance, have that audio feedback? Some people can change their pitch in real time.
We do too. We do.
Yeah. So
all humans do. But most animals don't. Well, I would say we're actually more sophisticated than bats.
Those bats, I don't know if you can detect insects through using your voice. That's a little bit different. I already start thinking of like capabilities if we're able to study that more and find a more effective way of being able to use that on submarines or something like that to be able to use.
That's exactly what's that's exactly what's being done.
All right, so I'm not wrong. Cool.
You aren't wrong. You are right, right? And also for looking for mechanisms for blind people to see. Right, using echolocation. Yeah.
So they don't have to do like Braille or anything like that. They can actually use a form of like
not to read, not to communicate, but to send out sounds that they can learn to hear the echoes, so that they can navigate and orient.
There was something similar that I read about a guy who started to lose his sight, and as he was losing his sight, he took these little little magnets, and he posted them around town where he lived before he fully lost his sight. So when he could navigate the town when he became blind, he would touch these magnets. So it's kind of similar. Well, it's like similar in that aspect. If you can have blind people be able to use some type of sonar, some type of frequency thing to be able to detect, like if something's in front of them, they can walk around it if it's an obstacle, so they don't have to have like a seeing eye dog or something.
Exactly.
That's awesome.
Yeah, well, that's pretty cool.
So if we're talking about human capabilities, for instance, of learning, how would you be able to help someone who might have like a disability where they're blind and deaf?
I have no idea. I won't lie. That's not my bailiwick at all. I can tell you a lot more about bats than people, I think.
Well, okay, so what's another thing about bats that we haven't addressed? Like from
What is
your
something
research?
from my research? Let's
Yes.
see. Well, mostly it's been about how these things evolve, getting to places and recording these songs and figuring out which bat is saying what and what the structures are of the songs has kept me pretty busy.
Well,
Another aspect of bats, though, is that some species cooperate, right? And what I mean by, so one thing about humans is we have this tendency to cooperate with each other. Um, and for my doctoral work, I worked on the species in Trinidad, Phyllostomus estatus, this greater spear-nosed bats. And now these bats are cool because they live in this cave. I mean, they live in multiple places, but the population I studied lived in a cave. And what's kind of different about them is that that they live in these really like kind of clusters of females. And bats actually, another side tangent, bats are really long lived for being really small. So I think we're at like 20 something years lifespan on Phyllostomus estatus. Some of they have bats that are living 30 to 35 years, which is really amazing for a kind of a small mammal. And that's another whole area of research I'm not working on, but they're also working on them as models for aging, right? Like how do you not your system not break down after 30 years, right? But that's side tangent. But let's go back to the greater spear-nosed bat. So it ends up that these clusters are groups of females, okay, and they hang out with each other all the time, same group. You can go back to the cave 5-10 years later, and you've got the same bats hanging out with each other. And what we found is that when they give birth, they each give birth to one baby, one pup, what we call a pup. And then at night, they leave their pups and they go out and feed, and then they come back. But sometimes those babies actually fall to the floor of the cave. And that's not a good place to be. It's like knee deep in guano and cockroaches that could carry off small children, right? It's not a good place. So they can't fly. The babies can't fly yet. So what we ended up finding is that these groups, these social groups, okay, if females were from different social groups, they were coming down and attacking these pups that fell. Females from the same social group would actually guard pups from non-group mates. So you have these clans, these warring clans,
East and West, baby, East
of
and West.
bats that were coming down and attacking or saving pups. Now, what's even more remarkable is when we did genetic analyses, the females in these social groups aren't family. They are not related to each other. So the only thing holding them together are their social bonds. That is this cooperation. And they also have been found, and this wasn't my work, but from a part of the reason why we worked on them is we'd already known that there was something going on with these females that were hanging out for such long periods of time. Dr. Bowman and Dr. Wilkinson looked at these foraging calls they make, and it ends up that those calls are vocally learned, and bats learn the social call of their group. And when they find food, they produce their group specific call, and the group mates come and share the food, and then they defend that food against other bats from other groups. So we have this total bat society going on in this pitch black, knee deep in guano cave, basically.
So when they send out a signal like that to their social group, now it's not like a radio frequency. They can't just change channels. The other bats can hear their social call that
they can, but we would assume that they can tell, whether or not it's their group or another group. And if you're from another group and you might get your behind kicked by the other group, right? So they can recognize which group the calls, from which group the bats are calling from.
Well, that would be depending on what that is that they're calling about. Now, if it's like
this is specifically for food.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying though. So depending on how valuable the food is, for instance, if you have, depending on how big that social group is that is defending that food, if you send out a call about something that might be a prize objective to these bats, for instance, like a really high delicacy in the food thing, then you have, instead of having one little one to try and go after a big group's food, you're having a whole group come over and try and get that food.
I know that would be, you know, pretty amazing, right? But these are pretty big bats that can fly miles per night. So it's amazing that we figured this much out, you know, or they figured this much out because finding, you know, being able to track and watch this is not easy, right?
So is their neural network, for instance, like in their brain, are they able to, like, if they're doing, like, if they can hear themselves and be able to adjust their communication as such, does that mean that their brain has a very good adaptive trait when it comes to learning and processing their own communicational calls?
Well, we sure would think so. There's been a lot of neural research on perception of the sonar, right? They have specialized neurons for various that are basically tuned to delays between an outgoing pulse and a returning echo. Um, we don't know, I would argue, as much about how that is wired into production, where that audio vocal feedback steps in. But there are, in fact, Dr. Moss's lab at Hopkins that works a lot on auditory reception, how how their brains are able to do this, and the hippocampus, how you know our hippocampus is for navigation, right, and direction, right. Imagine a bat where ours, for example, is wired into sight. Okay, what happens if you don't use vision and instead use sound, right? So we can use bats for models for all sorts of things.
Now, if they're able to have different social groups in a sense, now, even with their communications, even if all bats can hear the same frequency, how long do you like, is it possible that eventually that they'll develop their own frequency in a sense to where some social
I
groups
would
wouldn't be able
doubt
to pick
it.
that up? Well, I mean,
No,
we have,
I would
I
doubt.
know language is different, for instance, like we can't understand Spanish unless you research Spanish.
But
But I mean,
that's an accent. It's not a different frequency. So frequency is really determined by the vibration of the vocal cords. And in bats, that there's going to be this strong kind of pressure, of how do I explain, like a specialization for those frequencies that they use for echolocation. And then we've also found that they hear actually in kind of two channels, echolocation and communication. But there's only so much. There's only so broad that the production can be, and so broad that your ears can be tuned to, right? So we wouldn't expect that to show up in frequency. Instead, it shows up in things like the pattern, like, the pattern of frequency change over time, the duration, whether or not there's pulses or gaps, etc.
have you noticed, like when you played those calls from the one being able to catch an insect to the one that was maybe a mating call or a courtship call, are you noticing like the pattern of its specific, I guess, beats or its tones that it makes? Like it seems like it's adding a lot more when it's like a courtship type thing than it does when it's just
Exactly.
being able to hunt. So it's effectiveness.
I would argue that it's because they're communicating different things, right? Sonar is not for communication. Sonar is for, I mean, it's not that it can't be eavesdropped upon and used for social communication, but it really evolved for the purpose of orientation. Whereas courtship song didn't evolve for echolocation, it evolved to basically tell a female, I'm Joe, I'm sexy. This is my territory. If you're a dude, I'm going to beat you up. I mean, that's really so very different. We would expect them to have different elements because they have totally different information that's being encoded.
Now, if we land in the realm of hypotheticals, I know you've had to had some thoughts about just possible things that you could learn from these bats. Maybe that might not be more scientific based. Like if you're talking about, like, for instance, helping blind people be able to walk or travel using this type of communication or this type of echolocation. Now, if we get to an aspect of like maybe another possible idea that might be far out of the realm of like where we're at, I guess, technology wise, but what do you see that else could be applied to?
Not just sonar, but we are also studying, well, not, I know I have colleagues who are also studying their flight, right? So it ends up that bats have these little hairs on their membranes that enables them essentially to detect airflow. So it may be that bat wings are going to be used to help develop better flying technologies.
Whoa. Now, is this all just been because we haven't really had the technology to be able to measure a lot of this stuff, or is this just an aspect of how like bats are very secluded away from, I guess, where most of our
I would
research?
say I would say a mix of both,
Okay.
right? We get better and better tech, to be able to, it's pretty complicated to be able to measure these, right? You basically put a bat in a wind tunnel, right? Um, so I'd say a mix, right?
Is there anything you're hoping in like the next year or so or next 2 years to get done with your research?
I am working on putting together, I have recordings that I haven't had time to get to because I'm also, as I mentioned, Director of Undergraduate Studies and having a lot of other tasks. I run 2 summer research programs for Johns Hopkins, or one is an NSF REU program and one is Amgen Scholars Program, which honestly keep me very busy. But I have trying to put together the evolution of songs in a group of bats, molosses that are basically part of the same family of the song I played for you. And hopefully we'll get recordings of a few more species to add to the mix. I
Now, is
know, not super exciting, but
well,
that's exciting for me.
it is interesting because have you ever heard of like using algorithms or using AI to be able to help detect and speed up the process a little bit as well too?
Yes, but there are a lot of more and more complex ways to analyze vocalizations. But uh, how to explain it? Getting those trained and working often takes more time than I don't manually measure everything. I generally semi automate, right? But a lot of it is, they're just huge data sets, right? It just takes time, you know.
Now, are you seeing a giant change in, let's say, a recording that you could have 5 years ago to a recording that you have now? Like, I'm just wondering if they're like, are they adapting? Are they evolving their language, speech patterns, or at least different types of song developments, for instance?
I have seen no evidence of that,
Okay.
right? We recorded like those songs I played from Taderida, from the Brazilian Freetail Bat, where some of them were from early mid 2000s. And then we've also recorded them. I've also recorded them in the last 2 years in other locations, and those patterns seem pretty ubiquitous.
Because I was thinking because of how like not saying language, but the way that we communicate, like the way that we talk, our focus on it, like making words cut shorter to say things faster. But with bats, it seems like they have an effective method that they use, and there's not really a wantingness or a
Yeah, and it
show of
depends
change.
on, I mean, they have a level of flexibility, I would argue, that's above many animals, but it doesn't, as far as we know, come close to human speech and language, where so even in, you might see differences over time, but it's not going to be as rapid as we see in humans.
And besides songbirds, is there another animal that is at the same level in a sense,
Whales,
like using
whale
the
song.
moanings?
Yeah, whales also, yeah, there's also whale songs. And dolphins, not quite as long, their vocalizations, but there is some evidence of vocal learning there. Songbirds, and there's some other vocal learnings, other mammals as well that have shown evidence for vocal learning. But as far as complex songs, there's been a few primates they found recently, but they seem kind of scattered. So what's interesting with bats is we're finding, not just single isolated cases, but it's one of those great middle areas. So it's not that every bat sings, right? But I think we're finding that not a lot, I'd say, a number of, I think we've got something like 15 species, 20 species so far that seem to be producing, at the very least, like these territorial calls. We've got 5 or 6 at least that produce pretty complex songs. So I don't know if we're going to find that kind of repeated evolution of complex songs in other groups of mammals like we see in bats, because I think it's related to the fact that bats already have this audio vocal system that is highly complex or sophisticated.
This might be a dumb thought, but have you ever tried playing one of those bat calls underwater? Because the way that, like, we were talking about, like for whales, for instance, it seems like I thought a lot of that was echoed because of the fact that they're underwater and their type of frequency that they can hit can cause it to broadcast out. It would be similar to the same thing with bats in a cave, correct?
Well, I guess if you get to really high humidity, but basically there wouldn't be much point because bats like us evolved to vocalize in air, not in water. So just like when you go underwater and when you're a kid and you and your buddy go underwater and try to talk to each other and you can't understand each other. Yeah, they're totally different media, so evolution is going to shape their vocalizations for the medium that they're in, air versus water.
It's you don't realize how complicated it is until you start learning about it.
Yeah, I like to argue, once you go bat, you never go back.
Um, and when it comes to like a certain area where you would probably get the most amount of data, like do you find that you're getting a lot of like access to resources, or do you have a lot of information that you can just find online, or that you might have a library of access to, or do you find that there's still, like you said, the amount of information that we don't know might be a lot more than the information that we do know? Now, is that just not only like I guess maybe the capability or the accessibility to having bats, but also is it more like just on an aspect of being able to go and study and have those research projects done towards bats?
Exactly. And I mean, like I said, though, bats are everywhere. I mean, who knows what we're going to find, what bat in the Amazon is going to have some, crazy song. And remember, bats are everywhere, right? So that's the thing. I mean, we are the amount of information we're getting, I would say, is on an accelerated curve. We're learning, there's more researchers in Africa, there's more researchers in China, because there's, and in India, as well as other, and Central South America. So again, we're continuing to learn more. But given the hidden kind of nature of bats, um, it they're not as obvious, right? As you got to kind of be looking for them to find them.
Now, can we use this? It might be another dumb question, but can we use the same learning methods and apply it to space as well too? Using kind of like it as like being able to detect certain anomalies or certain objects in space, much like we can do with satellites.
I think they do that well, I think sound is too slow. I think they do that using light, but basically looking at light reflections. But I'm not a astrophysicist, so.
I know, it's just like you start learning about like the way you just told me about being able to, I guess, detect insects in front of them and putting out those pulses. I'm like, I just picture applying that to so many different things to be able to detect, not just like for a blind person to be able to detect objects in front of them, but for anything. I mean, being able to use it for our devices and cell phones and things of this sort to be able to send out a frequency or something to be able to detect. I mean, Teslas. Instead of using certain sensor type models, that seems like more effective than a car could have possibly do with the technology we have now.
I don't know, but not my bailiwick, but.
um, and if there was another field, like how did you get interested in studying bats? Like what was the initial thing? Did you just research wanting to learn more about echo communication?
No, I mean, I did my bachelor's was in ecology, animal behavior, and evolution. So I knew I was interested particularly in all 3 of those. And I had caught bats previously during a tropical program I went on as an undergrad. And it was pretty amazing. Just the fact that you're sitting there in pitch black, you don't hear a thing, you haven't missed net up, you turn on your flashlight, you've got 5 bats that you didn't even know flew right by you, right? that was always pretty fascinating. And I knew I wanted to work on mammals. I'd always been kind of interested in mammals. And it really was kind of, I guess, coincidence or fate that there was a professor, Dr. Barry Keller at Idaho State University, that was looking for a master's student to work on ecology and conservation of bats in a national forest there. And so I accepted that master's program. And then once I started like catching it, I was basically going out and doing acoustic recordings and catching bats and looking at the effects of timber harvesting. And once I really started working with them and realized how much we didn't know, right? I was smitten a bit. And so then I went on, but I was really, as an undergrad, one of my favorite classes and areas was animal communication, because it was this interface of like math and physics and evolution and sound. And that brought me to University of Maryland to work with Dr. Wilkinson, specifically on bats. And so kind of from my master's is when I went batty. It wasn't, but it wasn't that I was always batty.
Yeah, well, it's just an interesting because you took I guess, a different take than probably than most of the public has a different understanding of bats. It always seen as like they're very, very infectious or they're very, very like contaminated. It's much like insects. You don't have a lot of people that are going to want to research insects just because, I mean, we're told from kids that they're dirty, don't touch that, put that down, you can get a disease or something like that. So maybe it's just bad education on the public when it comes to these types of animals.
Right. Well, they are right. I mean, don't handle bats, right? Don't touch them if you find one. They can carry disease, but they're not dirty little animals, and they're not rodents. They're totally different, and they have remarkable, again, remarkable abilities that we are just limited. We don't hear ultrasound. We don't see well at night. Like, we just don't. Humans are awful at realizing what they don't know, and that's what the key is with bats, that most people don't know, how kind of remarkable they are.
Now, I wonder if being involved with like researching the sounds that bats make, for instance, would your ears eventually develop to pick up certain frequencies?
Nope, it's pretty much set by your I mean, I've gotten pretty good, actually, even at my age, at hearing some of them, but your hearing is really defined by the hair cells in your cochlea. So no, you're not going to suddenly develop. I mean, you might, get a bit better, but the hearing range isn't going to suddenly expand or anything.
I'm happy there's someone out there like you though that's able to research this type of stuff because it's a complicated process. I mean, you have to get headaches sometime from just listening to the sounds over and over again, right?
Right. Well, a
Okay.
lot of it I do, instead of, I mean, I listen as well, but is done through computer software, where I'm basically measuring the frequency, duration, pitch, all of that in the vocalizations on, using software.
Hmm. Still fascinating. I mean, even
Well,
using
that's good.
even using software, I know because you're talking about recording stuff as well too. It's just it has me thinking because I always wonder, like for my ears, for instance, I'm constantly having headphones in doing a podcast or something like that. Now it's different frequency. Well, it's different in the sense that there's not like high pitched frequencies and stuff, but you're constantly hearing something in your head. There's this thing called radio syndrome or something like that, where if you have like a radio, I used to work at a hotel, we had these radios that you clip onto your side. Eventually I would hear my name like called out of nowhere, even though I didn't have a radio on. I would be home or something like that. It was just from having one around me for so long that I would hear like this like ghost kind of call out or something like that.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
So
That's true.
that's why I was asking the
Yeah,
question about that.
yeah.
Well, look, I appreciate you for giving me your time. Is there a place where people can find any of your links?
Oh, not anymore. Really, I don't have as my lab site is less up, because again, I'm doing so much with the behavioral bio program, but I'm the only Kisi Bohn out there, so you can always Google me.
All right. Well, I'll link it, any of your links in the description that I find on Google. It's been a pleasure chatting with you. And thanks for listening to this episode of Out of the Blank.